You are listening to Demystifying Organizations. In partnership with McGraw-Hill Education, I'm your host, Jeff Shatton. Just a note before we get started, I've been releasing an episode a week for the past several months, and I will now be moving toward releasing an episode every few weeks, give or take. So just a heads up. My guest today is Mark Coddington. Mark is an assistant professor of journalism and mass communication at Washington and Lee University. He's the author of the recent book, Aggregating the News. Mark earned his Ph.D. in journalism from the University of Texas at Austin. He's a contributor to the Nieman Journalism Lab at Harvard University. Coddington's research has been published in journals including Mass Communication and Society, Journalism and Mass Communication Quarterly, Journalism Studies, and the International Journal of Communication. I'd like to welcome Mark Coddington to the podcast. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
Yeah, you helped on the early stages of launching this thing. Remember meeting with you a little while back as I was getting ready to launch a podcast.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I helped, but I was involved. I was involved at least. Yes.
So it's good. It's good to have you on. So your book that just came out. First of all, congratulations.
Thanks.
It's all about news aggregation.
Mm-hmm.
And for those who don't know, can you just give us a high level idea of what is news aggregation?
So news aggregation, I have a very, kind of technical official definition in the book, which is more or less taking news that's been published somewhere else and repackaging it and reformatting it in some way, usually an abbreviated way, and then republishing it in some other form. So what that actually means is I think it's most helpful to kind of define by example. Most of the stuff you see in if you use your Facebook feed, most of the news that you see in your Facebook feed is aggregated because it got published somewhere else. And then there's some pop culture website or, angry political news website sort of repackaging it, for maximum outrage and clicks. Or email newsletters are a really popular form of aggregation. And then also apps like, Apple News, Smart News, Flipboard, Google News is, a really, really big prominent aggregator. So basically, it can be done in automated forms, or it can be done by just people who are constantly sort of scouring the internet for what is going on and what people are talking about now, and finding ways to kind of repackage it for whatever their organization's intended audience is. So all of those things. Yeah.
So these are the ones that people are really familiar with. Mm-hmm. When I first started reading your book, that's what I think of when I think of aggregating the news. I think of Flipboard. I think of the Apple News app. Mm-hmm. The next layer that was surprising to me is just the number of people that you would think as quote unquote traditional journalists are actually aggregators. Mm-hmm. Can you walk mm-hmm. through how our more reputable sources, whether that's the New York Times or Washington Post, mm-hmm. how are they aggregating the news?
Yeah, so both those organizations, the New York Times and Washington Post, they both have teams of reporters who do what I would describe as aggregation. And of course, one of the points, of the book, and one of the caveats is that it's rare that a lot of this work is purely aggregation. A lot of it kind of straddles the boundary between aggregation and reporting, and it kind of goes back and forth, one day to the next. But they'll have teams which they'll call, the New York Times has been called the New York Times Express team. The Washington Post has a breaking news desk, and many other organizations will have something titled, like that. And basically what they're doing, their job is to basically see what's being talked about online. Their sort of beat, journalists have, their particular area that they cover, City Hall or the courthouse or something like that. Their beat is just be online and what are people talking about online.
Amazing.
And so, yeah.
Amazing. It's just not what I think of in the New York Times.
Right.
Be online and follow Twitter.
Yes, that's exactly it. So that team started in about the New York Times in maybe 2013, 2014. I'm not sure if it's still going by that that name internally. But basically, they got a number of reporters who, when there is a story online, now the New York Times kind of distinguishes itself in that they are sort of above mere aggregation, and they will make sure they're going to make the phone call and they're going to actually like provide some new information. They wouldn't even really describe what they do as aggregation because they say, no, we're just reporting on stuff that people are talking about on social media, or something like that.
But when you say people are talking about on social media, don't we mean that some other news source has already published?
Yeah. Usually, or it's some, tweets that have made people really angry, or something like that, which is a form of publication. Somebody just self-published on, through Twitter as a platform or through an Instagram post.
So let's go through an example. Like let's say there's someone in Ukraine who sends a video, right? Russia's coming in and someone sends a video on Twitter. And maybe there's some Ukrainian newspaper that publishes something. What does our traditional journal outlets do about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, that would depend from one publication to another. But in general, they're going to try to, figure out, one, they're going to try to determine the veracity of whatever this video is and try to determine, is this some sort of legit video or is this photoshopped? And they're going to use whatever tools they can to try to figure this out. And then their goal is probably to provide some context. Like, you may have seen this video go viral, but here's the actual context of this video or something like that. And a lot of the organizations that try to consider, their aggregation as sort of a higher form, they will try to go make sure they get some spokesman for the Ukrainian government on the phone saying like, oh, this in no way represents who we are, or whatever we're talking about, and others will just be like, hey, this was posted on Twitter. Here's like 15 tweets of people talking about it and making funny jokes, and that's fundamentally the same thing. Yeah. The question is like, are you making a phone call and trying to put it in context? Or are you just saying like, here's the thing people are talking about on Twitter. When people Google it, I want my article to kind of show up as like, why is everybody making jokes about the Ukrainian, the Ukrainian tank that ran over a rubber duck? I don't know.
But we'll get back to the absurd ones.
Yeah,
what I want to focus on just for a minute are the traditional outlets, the New York Times and the Washington Post. Because I've subscribed to pretty much most of our major publications, and my image as I'm reading articles is there's a reporter who is there's an in-depth reporter, which is what I'm paying for, that is in Ukraine, or obviously they're not everywhere, but I assume when something happens in a major country and this is getting reported on in the New York Times, that what my subscription is paying for is somebody who is there to document it.
And usually, again, the New York Times is sort of this sui generis, kind of exception in that like they are actually likely to have somebody there. If it is important enough to be an international incident, they'll at least have a reporter from their Moscow, bureau or something like that. And maybe it'll be additional reporting from so-and-so who's talking about the social media uproar or something like that. The breaking news desk will be the breaking news desk will be the people who are reporting on stuff that's not quite important enough to like go have your actual like reporter in the bureau covering it. It's more just like people are mad online about this thing. With other organizations, I mean, you will see this a lot in local TV news. I mean, this has become like a local TV news job. It's basically like, what things can we repackage or localize that has come up trending on Facebook or on Twitter or something like that can be repackaged in some way for our local audience, so we can take this big international story that has nothing really to do with our market area and at least get some share of the clicks and the attention on this story. And like, how reputable of a news organization that is, depends on how reputable local TV news is in your mind. So the New York Times would be practicing sort of the highest form of this that's going to be most closely embedded in and tied to reporting. And then others will be sort of on down from there. And of course, there are other people, auxiliary people at the New York Times, whose whole job is, say, putting together the daily newsletter, which all they're doing is aggregating stuff from the New York Times and from other publications. And there's like somebody who's on their digital team just doing that work. And they're sort of supplementing the work of the reporters around the world as well.
So when I think of journalism, I think of the fundamental role, as I see it, is arbiters of truth. Right. In some way, they're obvious in its ideal form, they'd be a form of an umpire.
Yeah.
Of course, they're not an umpire. It's well documented that, of course, there's subjectivity, but there is a realm of deciding what is true and what's not true, and also to speak truth to power. How does aggregating the news impact this kind of lofty goal that I've laid out,
right?
In terms of how the relationship between the media and the public's understanding of what is true and what's not true?
So I guess it goes back to, I'm going to do the classic academic thing and answer your question with a question. When you see journalists performing that goal of being the arbiter of truth, how do they know what's true as it's performed ideally? How would you like them to know what's true?
Ideally, they would be doing original sourcing. So they would be contacting sources that are at the event, witnesses, and then hopefully multiple sides. I'd want original documents. I'd want it to be backed up with evidence, and not just an interview, but I'd want to see them talking to the people that were there, and then hopefully emails or court documents or something else that's then going to provide another layer, and then pulling those things together to get a line that can, say, well, these things align or don't align or something like that.
Right. Absolutely. And I think you've just answered like the textbook idea of like, this is sort of our societal idea and a lot of like journalists' fundamental idea of what reporting should be. We use all these techniques to get really close to the truth. And if we get close to the truth in an ideal world, people will trust us that what we're reporting is true. And obviously for a variety of reasons, as you said, people don't trust the media. But that's the basic model. That's the idea. The problem is with aggregation is when you talk about like being there at the scene, aggregators are not there at the scene in terms of talking to people. Sometimes they talk to people. Sometimes they talk to people a little bit. Other times they don't talk to them at all. In terms of documents, they can only get documents if somebody has put them online where they can get them. They're not going to the courthouse to go get, the documents. They're not having anybody leak them stuff, by and large. So all those forms of access to information that sort of give you that seal of approval that they're like, this is true and this can be trusted, like aggregators by and large just don't have access to them, or they don't have as much access to them. So they are sort of constantly, as a fundamental characteristic, trying to compensate for that, trying to find ways to at least get closer. They know that ideally they would all, love to be the person who is in the field, embedded, in some big political event. But the fact is they're just not, which A, reduces your belief that they could ever really be an arbiter of truth, and B, sort of infuses them with this fundamental kind of in uncertainty and inferiority that they themselves can even be an arbiter of truth.
So what happens? Do we just end up with real fake news more?
I don't know. What is real fake news? But
you know what I mean? Like a Pizzagate or whatever.
Right. I think the overall effect on our quality of news is not great if we're, if you think of like a copy of a copy, that we're talking about. With every copy, at least as a general principle, as it goes also for information, the information is going to be degraded. The further you get removed from the truth, you can counteract that if you're using your distance to basically piece together this account and saying, okay, well, this is what squares with this account. This is what, doesn't square with this account. So I, with some sort of, expertise, can kind of pull back and say, well, his person's on the ground, but they're only seeing this part. This person's on the ground, but they're only seeing this part. I, who would kind of know a little bit more about the situation, can kind of zoom out and say, here are all these perspectives, and give me kind of a more multi-perspectival, kind of view of truth. That's if things are going well.
So then all news becomes an op-ed. Because that's what we're doing in an op-ed.
Yeah.
When you write an op-ed, you're saying, look, I'm not pretending at all, but it was just more honest in an op-ed.
Right.
I'm not pretending to be anywhere that has this. Here's my opinion. Yeah. Here's some evidence to back it up.
Yeah. No, that's kind of, what, sort of mischievous journalism scholars have been saying that for decades, that like, objectivity is a myth. All of it is subjective, and all of it is based on individual experience. The question is the extent to which you can bring evidence to bear to say, all right, you're gonna have to trust me that I was there at this scene and this happened. But if you don't, I also have these documents. I also talked to this person, et cetera, et cetera.
Which is a far cry. Yeah. Well, that's because, we can get back to Socrates and say, what is true? Well, if we want to have, just in terms of epistemology, if we want to have supreme skepticism, then maybe nothing's true. But we can get really close through, like this. When I think of traditional journalism as was practiced before the internet, and like we see with deep dive journalism, you start getting closer to the truth. I don't know if you've read Bob Woodward's book, Fear. And you might not like Bob Woodward.
No, I'm fine with Bob Woodward.
But that kind of method, where at least the method is what exactly happened in the Trump White House in the first year or so. We'll never know exactly. But Bob Woodward does as good of a job as I think you're going to get in terms of piecing out what is the truth.
Right, and that's I think a good point, in that we can't all really be, and none of us actually are, save for a few very rigorous and disciplined philosophers. None of us are actually Socrates on a day-to-day basis.
Sure.
We simply have to believe things on less proof than would satisfy our, philosophy 101 professors. We just have to. And it's especially that way with the news, that we just have to, the journalist who is, covering the war zone just simply has to ask the commanders, ask the rebel groups, and just kind of go, this is what these people said. This is what these people said. I'm going to at least kind of dress it up with an air of authority, because I'm as close to this as any theoretically impartial source as you're going to find. And it's kind of up to you whether to kind of trust it or not. So given that, I think you're right that like investigative journalism, the type of stuff, really deep dive stuff that you're going to do, and like Bob Woodward's, where it takes a full book to really lay this stuff out, that's as good as modern journalism can do. But that is like 1% of modern journalism. Like nobody else, not nobody, but hardly anybody else has the kind of time and as long of a leash as Bob Woodward does to painstakingly, assemble this puzzle of what's going on. Everybody else is just dealing with constant time pressures, constantly bearing down multiple deadlines and multiple, publications that they got to write for and all this kind of stuff. And so it ends up being a lot more kind of hodgepodge.
Some of this gets to the business model that we see with modern publications and modern journalism outlets. If we think back to the way that these things were structured, let's just take newspapers 30 years ago, right? Even a local newspaper would have the kind of budget to send somebody to Washington, D.C. to you could have a B city with a journalist that's going to be in D.C. talking to members of the House and members of the Senate. They might even have somebody go into Europe when there's a major incident in Europe. They also have the business model affords a different time issue, which is they were publishing the paper every day, not coming out with things every single second. Right. And then furthermore, there was no such thing as a citizen journalist, right? You weren't in the era where everybody all of a sudden is a journalist with a cell phone and a video camera, throwing out information and now competing with the Washington Post or the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Right. So I wanted to see just from your end, like, how do you see this, fundamental shift from subscriptions with print to, I guess, ultimately what we should get to as clickbait?
Right. So you're absolutely right in that there are a couple kind of trends that are happening together and are really two sides of the same coin. That a lot of this aggregation has sort of arisen as a dominant form of journalistic news work at the same time, and because the amount of time and budget to do the more in-depth reporting work has decreased. Like we still got to put out content because we got to sell ads against it, and we just need a cheap, simple way to put out content. What is the cheapest, simplest way that you can put out content besides rerunning wire content? It's to have people just aggregate content and pump it out as quickly as possible.
And so when you say rerunning wire, you mean like AP?
Yeah, AP.
Okay.
AP writers, whatever. Yeah. And you can do that as well. But I mean, even that's not cheap because you got to pay. You got to pay those subscriptions. Those subscriptions aren't cheap. So it's exactly right that the budget is part of it. I think one of the exacerbating problems is a citizen journalism issue, as you mentioned. All those different ways of kind of getting at the truth of many different situations are no longer exclusive to journalists. newsmakers can just tweet themselves. And so now any of us can know what President Trump was in theory thinking when he, signed or vetoed a bill or something like that. You don't need journalists doing White House intrigue. Like half the time they're just quoting his tweets in their articles anyway, because he's just telling us. Likewise, eyewitnesses, anybody, as you said, with their phone can say, I was on the scene, here it is, and they can give us the evidence for it. And likewise, with documents and data, this is democratized and anybody has access to this. So you're dealing with, journalism is in crisis for many reasons, but one of them is it's lost the exclusive jurisdiction over the information gathering processes that it used to have. And aggregation is one way of dealing with it and basically saying, we don't have that exclusivity anymore. So we're going to kind of step up a level and basically say, okay, we can't be the only ones providing you the exclusive access to the scene or something like that, but we can get really good at consuming vast quantities of information and being able to pull it out and try to make some sense of it in context.
One of the things that I find incredibly frustrating is when I Google something that I really want I want to do a deep dive into something. So I go into Google and I Google it, all right, I put it into Google News, and I end up with 35 of the exact same story, right? And I don't need the 35th outlet telling me the same thing. I'm looking for somebody with a new opinion,
right,
and or new perspective or new information, and it is literally just paraphrased. I mean, there could be 35 articles on the one topic I'm interested in, all paraphrased. How does one get beyond that if it's news oriented?
Yeah, that's a tough problem. And it depends on your particular subject of, area of interest. I can tell you how I do it in the areas that I'm interested in. One is you find a couple of news sources that are really good and that don't typically do that. And if you've got to, fork over the money and pay for them. For me, that's New York Times. I also really recommend NPR as well. Those are news sources that I generally don't find, are just duplicating other stuff and just kind of providing, as you said, one voice out of 35. If they're going to tell you something, they're going to actually have done the work to.
The issue, though, is that the other 34 come back to the New York Times.
Exactly.
Right. So the New York Times, which I subscribe to, is the original. Right.
They are the original, but you'd rather have the original than again the copy of the copy. Yeah.
And I'm trying to search it. It's usually something that's esoteric within finance or business or whatever.
Right.
And I'm like, there's got to be somebody out there that has some depth that's beyond just what the New York Times has already presented. Right. And often the answer is no.
No. Yeah. I mean, and the other thing is, I actually find that there are, especially within a particular industry, there are people who have like email newsletters, or I've found, I've been really careful about kind of curating a particular set of people that I follow on Twitter who I know among them are basically going to find and link to all the interesting stuff. And of course, I don't have time to spend on Twitter all day. I use an app called Nuzzle that kind of plugs into Twitter and it basically just collects all the links that the people that you're following on Twitter have shared that day, and just ranks them by the number of people who have shared it. So I just check at the end of the day on Twitter, what were people talking about? And I get it, it's according to the people that I've followed. So it's my bizarre confluence of interests. And that, if I don't get a whole lot of junk there, because if it's junk, a lot of people aren't going to share it. They might accidentally stumble across it in a Google search, but to get smart people, hopefully I follow smart people to say, this is really interesting. You should check this out. And if multiple people are doing that, that's a pretty good signal that I got something.
Yeah, I like Twitter a lot for that. I mean, Twitter is where you get the most sophisticated people.
It's terrible, right? It's terrible in a lot of other ways, but it's great for that.
If you follow the right people,
absolutely,
it is the most sophisticated perspectives.
Yeah, I always talk about the people I follow on Twitter as being the editors of the internet for me.
Yeah,
their job is to edit the internet for me, and I've basically kind of selected you all together. I trust you all to unearth everything interesting that I care about. If I get cast a wide enough net, I'm going to get it all in one day. Yeah.
Should the major outlets, the Wall Street Journal, the Post, the New York Times, Vox, New Republic, should We can throw maybe 10 others.
Yeah, sure.
Should they all come together and set some guidelines about like what they will and will not aggregate? Because it seems such a mess.
Yeah.
Right. Shouldn't there be some large conglomerate of the reputable sources? Like, look, we understand that there's 1,000 others that are not going to do this, but we're going to kind of stop aggregating each other's work.
This is, this is something where I feel like very American in responding, where I'm just like, no, just like protect everybody's autonomy. Let everybody do whatever they want to do. Like it's much more of a European sort of response. And the European press has a long, long tradition of having a little bit more kind of strictures that the press has set around themselves, ethical codes, or they're actually like punishments that, press councils will set for violating them. And they have been, and those governments have been a lot more aggressive against Google for what Google can do when it aggregates. Whereas the United States, we just kind of like hold up our First Amendment and we're just screw you. But exactly, it's not.
It's not the government.
It's not the government. But that sort of mentality has run so deep in American journalists that they're just like so deeply resistant to anyone telling them what to do or how to do it, even if it's them collectively, deciding among themselves. I honestly think the reputable, quote unquote, reputable news orgs, I don't think I see much of a problem in the way they aggregate. As is, I think they do it. They've gotten a lot better at it. I think they do it pretty smartly. I think they do it in a way that actually like adds to people's understanding and adds clarity. In terms of what they decide is an interesting story. I mean, that's everybody's going to decide that themselves. But
you ready? What I think it should have, and let's say Vox does a deep dive into Jeffrey Epstein. Okay, and it's really the article that comes out, right? The New York Times should just have a link that says see Vox.
Yeah.
And it should be like headline, Vox finds this.
Right.
Here's the link. Go read their article.
And there's actually, what you're articulating is there's a philosophy that was very popular in the late 2000s by a journalism professor and kind of media pundit named Jeff Jarvis. His philosophy that he talked about was do what you do best and link to the rest. Whatever you're actually good at, do it. And if you see something that somebody else did that you like, don't try to do some half-assed effort to replicate it, whatever. Just say, hey, go find these people. And it'll actually come back to you in the form of trust. The people will say, if they're pointing me to something, they're basically saying this was good enough that we didn't want to take the effort to try to updo it. And they'll say, okay, we trust you. You're not going to be super provincial about, well, we only link to our own stuff. You're going to point me to interesting information wherever it is. So I think that's absolutely a great idea. And I think it happens more than you might think. I think there are a lot of, again, it might not be like on the front page of the New York Times. They might not have a headline that's like, go check out this Vox article. Like, no, that's too valuable a real estate to do that with. But again, if you start to get into the email newsletters, the Twitter accounts of their journalists, they're always tweeting great articles by their colleagues. I subscribe to a big CNN email newsletter about the media, and probably 80% of the links are to all over the rest of the internet. And their goal is to basically go through all this stuff and present it to you so that they can be your conduit and they can go through it so you don't have to.
Because we want to incentivize people to do a 1-year deep dive on the ground in Afghanistan. And if their article comes out after 1 year of being embedded in the local tribes or whatever they've done, they should be that should be the article that's getting read, not the 50th publication that is then claiming that they now know about tribal activity in Afghanistan.
Now, and obviously, in the case of that example, the tribal Afghanistan activity in Afghanistan article is so unlikely to generate massive amounts of page views that nobody's going to aggregate it in the first place. But I mean, I think you're right, and that's something that the news industry has wrestled with for a long time, and some of them have kind of placed that that blame at the feet of Google and that sort of thing. And actually, scholars have looked at it, mostly economists who have looked at it from that perspective, have generally found that as long as the aggregators are not providing too long of excerpts or too much of the original source, that they actually have a net positive effect on the original source. Again, as long as they are still kind of providing some need for the reader to still click through to the original article. They actually do well in expanding the reach and the attention of that article. They start to work in reverse, where they basically, take enough of the article where it's not even necessary for you to click on it. So you're right that it really does depend on how it's written. Although, again, I think most of the, non sort of fly by night news organizations, the reputable ones, have gotten a lot sort of better, and they've gotten a little bit more professionalized in how they do this over the past decade.
All right, then let's move to the other end of the spectrum into clickbait.
Yeah.
So first of all, what is clickbait?
Oh man. So clickbait, and one of the points of my book is it is totally in the eye of the beholder, especially for self-serving reasons. That basically all the journalists I talked to they had very strong opinions of what clickbait was, but the key is whatever I'm not doing. It's just a little bit worse than whatever I'm doing.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember the definition I pieced together in my book, mashing together a couple of definitions. There's one where essentially that there's a promise that is sort of delivered in the headline that is not met in the article. Something like that.
So
That's
what's an example of that?
That would be something like, on the spot, I'm trying to think. It would be something like, like Rihanna and whoever is a celebrity associated with Rihanna are in total feud. They're, whatever. And then it turns out all Rihanna did was tweet about something that might be maybe a reference to this person. And you're just
you'll never believe what Rihanna did.
Yeah, exactly. That sort of thing.
And so for the public, that's juicy, attractive. That's eye candy.
Right. Yeah. So that's part of it. But there's also just whenever it is something that's meant to suck in your attention, and it's just of a very low quality. There's no trickery. 16 reasons why the Popeyes fried chicken sandwich is better than the Chick-fil-A one. There's no trickery. You know what you're getting when you click on it, but it's also it's so stupid that you never feel fulfilled after you click on it. You feel like you just ate a whole bag full of Peeps.
But we might not, but there's somebody who might. But
the whole purpose is that nobody is actually trying to create quality content. They're trying to basically just get you enough to click on it. How you feel after you read the article is kind of secondary.
So you've talked to some of these people who we might call clickbait. Mm-hmm. How do they identify with the content that they're producing?
Well, generally, some of them are just kind of adamant that they're not doing clickbait, and they just totally disassociate themselves. The ones who find it harder to do that basically will just kind of cast doubt on the entire idea of clickbait. That such a thing is even.
But never mind that, right? They know. So, but there's a lot of people who they're producing this stuff, and if you were to say to them, "Well, do you read these articles?" I'd be like, "I don't read this. I don't read this stuff." Are you interested in this? No. Right. Why do you do this? So what is your?
I would say so. Some of the people who aren't, they almost view it as a selfless act. To produce news that's not for you. This is the stuff where I am the intended audience, and it's news that is for and about me. I'm producing news that other people want to read. How do I know other people want to read? Look at our traffic numbers and look at me doing this thing, slogging through, writing about, whatever Tiger Woods did in a tournament this weekend, even though he missed the cut again, because people want to read about Tiger Woods. And I'm not writing for myself. I'm writing for the people.
Okay. So the whole business model, right, is whatever it takes to get masses of people to click on this article, right? Which is fundamental. That seems to be how they're at least financially incentivized.
Yeah,
at least the business model, right, is they literally do get money per click.
And it really depends. There are some of the shadiest places where it really is whatever it takes. The places that I visited, I think, were a little bit better and sort of more ethical and on the up and up than people might give them credit for, because again, the people who work there, they have to, in some way, feel proud of themselves. They have to otherwise they're going to quit their job after 3 months. They're going to feel really gross. And so there has to be some way as an organization for you to kind of inculcate this notion that what we're doing is worth doing. Please stick around.
Do they believe it? do they believe that it's worth doing? Or they fed that?
Yes and no. Like, I think they believe that the journalistic profession is worth pursuing, and this is how you get started. And like someday I'm going to do better, and I'm going to do more. And you just got to do what you're going to do when you're 23 years old and whatever. They also, a lot of them, people who are doing this kind of work, though, especially the people that I visited, they're not doing this all day every day. They're doing this for part of the day, and then in their spare time, they have some story that actually involves going and talking to people and telling some amazing story. That is what they really want to spend their time doing. So this is the part of their job that they just kind of do to pay the bills and keep the lights on so they can do the other part of their job that they love to do.
And how profitable are these clickbait farms?
In the less and less so. In the near term, kind of. In the long term, not so much. And this is really something that if there is some encouragement, that something can be taken away from this is that we've seen the online advertising industry, which at some point was considered a savior, has just it's been revealed to have just never been something to rely on. It is just pennies on the dollar, and is more or less collapsed as a viable business model. And so you're seeing all these news organizations, one after another, kind of retreating back to subscriptions and something like that. And so of course, in the near term, that means the failure of a lot of organizations that were relying on this type of work, which is not good. It means people getting laid off and losing their jobs, and that's always a bad thing.
Or not
people. For those people specifically. Yes. But long term, right? Long term, I think it was just necessary and inevitable that those news organizations were going to have to abandon that as a model. And if you think about what those types of models, what type of content those types of models incentivize, they incentivize totally different types of content. What is going to attract enough clicks, enough hundreds of thousands of clicks to make an ad-based model work? Clickbait. What is going to actually get thousands of people to subscribe and pay money every month for your site? Not clickbait. It's going to have to be something that is unique, that is valuable, that is distinct, that is, provides some sort of depth, some sort of context, some sort of new information. And that's all getting us back towards higher quality information. I think aggregation can be a part of that because I think there's still value in being able to edit the internet for other people and be able to say, hey, look, you have a job, you have a life. You can't spend all your time, on the internet and on social media scouring it for whatever's of interest to you in your field. So I'm going to do this for you as a service so you can take 5 minutes at the beginning of your workday and do this. And that, in addition to like scoops and valuable information, that sort of thing, that's something that people might pay for, that they're not going to pay for, again, the 16 reasons that the Popeyes chicken sandwich is superior to Chick-fil-A. So in the end, that's a good thing.
And where do you see this going in the next 10 years, let's say? That aggregation question.
Yeah, I think it's going to shift more towards that model, towards where we're going to be. There's always going to be people who can think they can make a quick buck through, getting a whole bunch of page views, through some form or another, But I think that as a gateway to a viable business strategy is fading out pretty quickly. And I think the focus is really consolidating in the media industry around subscriptions and really getting laser focused on how do we kind of make a value proposition that's enough for people to pay, and getting more and more fine-grained in like precisely what gets people to pay. And I think ultimately that's going to be better for consumers.
Are you concerned about the winner-take-all phenomenon, right? That in the digital world, right? No matter where you look, whether that's Beyonce with digital downloads, whether that's the Joe Rogan podcast, Apple in terms of phones, like pretty much any place you look, we have moved into a winner-take-all economy. What is the effect of that in terms of there will be 4 papers that get all the subscribers, and then there's not even a B class?
Yeah, nothing quite that severe, but I think you're right in that that's the general direction that we're headed. Like, of all the organizations that have instituted subscription models, or at least all the recent ones. The Wall Street Journal is in a different category because it's been doing that since the 90s, online subscriptions, right? Because everybody's, getting it comped, and that sort of thing. But out of the recent converts, the New York Times is doing so much better than everybody else because they were the first mover and because is a rich get richer. Like, of course, I'm going to subscribe to the New York Times because they have a better and more robust news gathering staff than anybody else. Like, why am I going to subscribe to my local 50,000 circulation newspaper? I'm not. Unless there's something going on locally that is just of intense value to me. So I think other news organizations overestimate their own value proposition. Other than those massive few, your New York Times, your Washington Post, your Wall Street Journal, and then your very well regarded niche, publications like the Atlantic is going to start charging for subscriptions, and I think I'll be really curious to see how they do on that front as well. And Britain, The Guardian has gone to that model with some real success. But for us, your Roanoke Times, or newspapers in Chattanooga or Kansas City or wherever else who are doing that, at some point, people's real interest in their pocketbook just starts to kind of run dry, and so I really do think that there's a rich get richer effect. I think that ultimately a lot of good organizations are going to get hollowed out, and they already have been. I don't think it's quite as extreme as there will only be 4 news organizations or something like that. It's still too easy to just pop up and provide an interesting product and kind of at least conglomerate some sort of modest level of support that somebody could live off of. But I do think we're going to see a big hollowing out of the middle, and we already have.
How much has news aggregation changed in the aftermath of Russia in the 2016 election? Were there lessons learned from that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure that the work of aggregation has actually changed that much because a lot of the changes for the better that it was making, they were kind of already in the works. Mm-hmm. It's just a lot different than it was. I think on that front, the things that were most instrumental in changing it were Facebook's algorithm newsfeed changes to cut down on "you won't believe what Rihanna did" type headlines. That had a bigger effect on how people aggregated than the 2016 election because that more directly affected their bottom lines and their pocketbooks. In terms of the election specifically, I think there's more wariness of misinformation and a little bit. I would like to say there's less breathlessness, but let's be honest, there's not. But I do think there's hopefully a little bit more of a trend towards wanting to verify things as opposed to getting it immediately and running with it, because there's just that lurking thing back in your mind. It's just, is this a Macedonian teenager or is this actually something that actually happened? So I think there's a little bit more awareness of that. I think on the whole, from the consumer side, it's made it much worse because the general just climate of skepticism has just blown up since 2016, and it's a lot more difficult for news organizations to really make the case that they could be arbiters of truth, whether they're aggregating or whether they're doing Bob Woodward length, deep dive books. So in terms of the work itself, I'm not sure that that's changed as much because of that, so much as changes in the business model and changes in Facebook's newsfeed.
All right. This has been really a fascinating conversation. Thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Jeff.
Thanks for listening to the podcast today. If you have any questions or comments, you can email me at jeffshatten1@gmail.com. You can tweet me at jeffshatten. If you like this podcast, press the subscribe button and make sure to rate it on iTunes so that other people can find it.